Welcome to Mr. Beebop. Ariadne Oliver is a fictional character in the novels of Agatha Christie. She is a mystery novelist and a friend of Hercule Poirot. Here are some interesting facts about the distinguished authoress. Mrs. Oliver is a middle-aged woman and successful detective novelist, described as handsome in a rather untidy fashion, with fine eyes, substantial shoulders, and a large quantity of rebellious gray hair with which she was continuously experimenting. She is feisty, quick to jump to conclusions, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, and strongly believes that Scotland Yard would be better run by a woman. She is particularly fond of apples, which becomes a plot point in the novel Halloween Party. Mrs. Oliver is always convinced right from the start that she knows who the murderer is, and she is not one to let a little matter of complete lack of motive or evidence to persuade her otherwise. But then something will occur that will make her switch her suspicions onto another possible killer, and then another. And when the real murderer is unmasked, she will declare, "I always said he or she did it." She's a bit scatterbrained and disorganized, but very kindly, and she actually is quite intuitive. For example, in Dead Man's Folly, when she has been asked to arrange a murder hunt at a garden fete in the grounds of a large country house, she becomes very uneasy without knowing why. So strong are these feelings that she calls in Poirot and expresses her fears to him. And in the event, her intuition proves to have been well-founded, as a real murder takes place shortly after. Mrs. Oliver often assists Poirot in his cases through her knowledge of the criminal mind. She often claims to be endowed with particular feminine intuition, but it usually leads her astray. In the books, Oliver's most famous works are those featuring her pedantic vegetarian Finn detective Sven Gerson. Since she knows nothing of Finland, Oliver frequently laments Gerson's existence. In The Pale Horse, Mrs. Oliver becomes acquainted with the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrope, who are friends of Miss Marple in The Moving Finger, thus establishing that Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot exist in the same world. Even in the one novel in which she appears without Poirot, Mrs. Oliver does not function as a detective, in that she rarely participates in the investigation and contributes only tangentially to the solution. In Cards on the Table, she does interview some of the suspects, and in Elephants Can Remember, she again interviews witnesses, but none of the essential ones. She is more usually used for comic relief or to provide a theory through her intuitive or sudden insights, a function that is especially apparent in Third Girl, in which she furnishes Poirot with virtually every important clue, or in The Pale Horse, where she inadvertently helps the investigators to determine the type of poison used to kill the murder victims, saving the life of another character. In Cards on the Table, there is a reference to Mrs. Oliver's book, The Body and the Library. This title was used by Christie 6 years later for a novel featuring Miss Marple. Further functions of Mrs. Oliver are to enable Christie to discuss overtly the techniques of detective fiction, to contrast the more fanciful apparatuses employed by mystery authors with the apparent realism of her own plots, and to satirize Christie's own experiences and instincts as a writer. Mrs. Oliver therefore serves a range of literary purposes for Christie. In Dead Man's Folly, she mentions having nephews and buying them Christmas presents. Although Ariadne Oliver is constantly referred to as Mrs. Oliver, nothing is known about her husband. An offhand reference to her marriage is made in Elephants Can Remember. In the same novel, a goddaughter of hers appears as well. She is in many ways a vehicle for Agatha Christie's own voice, particularly in relation to writing and the public. In a 1956 interview with John Bull magazine, Agatha Christie dismissed the idea that any of her characters are truly derived from real life, although she did admit that Mrs. Oliver has a strong dash of herself. Christie always took a somewhat tongue-in-cheek approach to her supposed fictional alter ego, who she credited with writing a novel called The Body and the Library, a title she would use herself in 1942. Both Agatha and Ariadne have a non-British detective with very distinct idiosyncrasies. Sven Gerson, Mrs. Oliver's Finnish detective, breaks the ice on his bath each morning. And Hercule Poirot, Christie's Belgian detective, cringes at anything crooked or disorderly. In many of her appearances, Oliver and her feelings toward her detective Gerson reflect Agatha Christie's own frustrations as an author, particularly with the Belgian Hercule Poirot. The self-caricature has also been used to discuss Christie's own follies in her earlier novels. For instance, in Mrs. McGinty's Death, Mrs. Oliver talks of having made a blowpipe a foot long in one of her novels, whereas the actual length is something like 4.5 feet. The same mistake Christie made in Death in the Clouds. Like Christie, she is a member of the Detection Club. Christie even thought of placing a murder at the club, with Oliver being one of the suspects or detectives, but it came to nothing. The true first appearance of Mrs. Oliver was a brief appearance in the short story The Case of the Discontented Soldier, which was first published, along with 4 other stories, in the August 1932 issue of Cosmopolitan magazine. The story was later published in book form in 1934 as Parker Pyne Investigates. Within this story, she appeared as part of Pyne's unorthodox team of freelance assistants. She also briefly appears in The Case of the Rich Woman, also published in the same book. Ariadne Oliver subsequently appears in 6 Poirot novels, assisting him, often in Hastings' stead, by providing her own unique perspective on each of the crimes they encounter. Her first appearance in a full-length novel with Poirot is in Cards on the Table. She finally appears on her own in The Pale Horse. The first appearance of Ariadne Oliver on television was in an episode of the Agatha Christie Hour in 1982. In an adaptation of the Parker Pine story, The Case of the Discontented Soldier, she was portrayed by Lally Bowers. Ariadne Oliver was portrayed on screen by Jean Stapleton in the 1986 adaptation of Dead Man's Folly, opposite Peter Ustinov as Poirot. In the 1990s, BBC Radio 4 cast Julia Mackenzie, later to be known for playing Miss Marple, in the role of Mrs. Oliver alongside John Moffat as Poirot in Mrs. McGinty's Dead Man's Folly, and Elephants Can Remember. Stephanie Cole also portrayed Mrs. Oliver for BBC Radio 4 in Cards on the Table, Halloween Party, and The Pale Horse. Zoe Wanamaker played Mrs. Oliver in 6 episodes of the British TV series Agatha Christie's Poirot. She debuted in 2005's Cards on the Table, and since then, Wanamaker has featured in a version of every novel in which Mrs. Oliver and Poirot join forces, concluding with Elephants Can Remember and Dead Man's Folly, both of which were adapted in the final series in 2013. Thank you for watching. See you again next time.